There's a word that's been insulted more times than your Wi Fi signal. It lurks in YouTube comments, screams from bumper stickers, and pops up in punchlines at your cousin's questionable open mic night. The word? Vulgar. But don't let the bad reputation fool you. Vulgar hasn't always been a four-letter word in a five-star society. Before it earned its crude credentials, it was something far simpler. A word of the people. Just your average, everyday, walking around kind of word. Polite? Maybe not. Popular? Absolutely. And today on Lexicon, we're digging into the grubby yet glorious history of the word vulgar, from its roots in Roman speech to its rise as a class divider, a literary weapon, and eventually a label for anything uncouth, unwanted, or unapologetically honest. Welcome back to Lexicon, the podcast where language gets a little loud and sometimes lewd. I'm your host TJ, and today we're exploring vulgar, a word that's been both praised and punished over centuries. From vulgar Latin to vulgar insults, it's a ride through culture, class, and communication. Now, the word vulgar comes from the Latin vulgaris, meaning common or pertaining to the multitude. It traces further back to vulgus, meaning the crowd, the common folk, the public. In ancient Rome, vulgus wasn't necessarily derogatory. It just meant the masses. The vulgaris lingua was the language of the people, plain, accessible, and distinctly different from the polished literary Latin of Cicero or Caesar. This is where we get the term vulgar Latin, the informal, everyday spoken language that gradually diverged and evolved into the Romance languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and even Romanian. So yes, your Duolingo lessons in Italian, they're rooted in vulgarity, and gloriously so. It wasn't until the late Middle Ages, and especially the Renaissance, that vulgar started picking up some negative baggage. As Latin remained the prestige language of the church, law, and high learning, local tongues were dismissed as vulgar languages, and that association with the common people shifted from everyday to meaning low class, uncultured, or even ignorant. Now, by the 17th century, English writers and critics were using vulgar to mean coarse or crude in taste, manners, or language. No longer just the common tongue, but the impolite one. Think vulgar jokes, vulgar gestures, and even vulgar table manners. One of the earliest recorded uses of vulgar to suggest something indecent appears in 1642, when English poet and satirist John Cleveland wrote of a vulgar and profane wit, signaling that shift from public to profane. The association with impropriety had begun to stick and cemented vulgar as a term of disapproval in both literary and social circles. And with that, the word took on its double life. Linguistically democratic on one hand and socially divisive on the other. And now here's a fun twist. If you were to hear the phrase vulgar establishment, it probably conjures images of seedy bars or late-night commercials, maybe even clickbait-laden media empires. But there is a second definition for vulgar establishment, and it's actually a technical term for tidal science, where it refers to the average interval of time that occurs between the moon's upper transit and the first high water following the transit that is taken at the time of the full moon or new moon. In other words, vulgar establishment measures the moon's influence on the tides, and by extension, how the universe quietly shapes what rises. Now, the irony? That a phrase loaded with assumptions about tastelessness and trashiness is, at its core, an elegant measure of natural rhythms. But still, cultural critics have gleefully hijacked this phrase to describe a world where the once fringe becomes foundational. A vulgar establishment where vulgarity isn't just accepted, it's institutionalized. Where those high and low cultures collide, the vulgar becomes intentional. As writer John McWhorter noted, vulgarity has a kind of power. It punctures elitism, challenges norms, and reflects what people actually think, not what they're told to think. So when vulgarity rises, it often reveals not social decline, but social discontent. Other languages play with this concept too. French has vulgaire, Spanish has vulgar, and Italian has volgare. Each one walks this same tightrope between common and crude. And the same linguistic accessibility shows up in other, less controversial corners too. Vulgar fractions, for example, well, that's just referring to the traditional everyday kind, like 3/4, half, 5/8, as opposed to those far more difficult decimal fractions. It's a reminder that vulgar doesn't always have to mean crude, sometimes it just means familiar. And then there's the Vulgar Dictionary. Now, this is a slang-filled compilation from the 18th and 19th centuries that document the vivid, irreverent, and often hilarious speech of the streets. In its pages, vulgarity wasn't cleaned up, it was celebrated. It preserved the voice of the people in all of its raw and riotous glory. Now, in modern media, vulgarity's found some defenders. From Lenny Bruce's taboo-breaking stand-up to Cardi B's uncensored lyrics, vulgarity is wielded as a rebellion. It's a voice, not a vice. But this really isn't a new tactic. In the 18th century, Jonathan Swift used coarse language to critique political corruption. And in the 1960s, comedians like George Carlin made obscenity a form of resistance against censorship and conformity. Vulgarity disrupts politeness to make room for protest. It's often the vernacular of the unheard, the language of revolution, satire, and social truth-telling, which kind of cements it as the language of the common people. So what have we learned? Well, what was once a neutral word for the people somehow became code for bad taste. And now? Well, now it's a badge of authenticity for some, a line too far for others.
I'm afraid profanity and all vulgar language is strictly forbidden.
Because vulgarity doesn't have to be a part of your everyday language, but it can be a useful tool when nuance fails or politeness masks the truth. At its most impactful, vulgarity says the quiet part out loud, revealing what's uncomfortable, unfiltered, and undeniably human. That's it for this episode of Lexicon. If you enjoyed today's uncensored journey, leave a review and don't be shy about your own vulgar opinions. And tune in next week as we continue to explore the essence of everyday language. As always, Lexicon is written, recorded, and produced by me, your Logophile companion, TJ Martin. Sources and additional credits are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.